Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our European friends. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem, and I'll be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth installment of Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series. Today's Real Science webinar is titled Dietary Protein, How Low Can You Go? With Dr. Larry Chase from Cornell University. Dr. Chase is currently Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. He earned his PhD from Penn State, following his MS from North Carolina State University and a BA from The Ohio State University. He had been on the faculty of the Department of Animal Science in Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences since 1975, with extension and research responsibilities, and served as Department Extension Leader from 2008 to 2014. Dr. Chase's research helped refine the biology within the CNCPS model. Dr. Chase, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be invited by Balchem to participate in this series. And today we're going to speak about protein feeding, and hopefully that'll be of value to you as you work with your clients in the future. Why are we interested in potentially feeding lower protein rations to dairy cows? From a dairyman's point, improve profitability because we can lower feed costs in most cases, maintain milk production, and improve income over feed cost. The second reason for looking at lower protein rations is we can improve the efficiency of nitrogen used in the dairy cow, which means we capture more of the intake nitrogen in the milk produced by the cow. And as we do that, there's less of the nitrogen excreted in the manure, which lowers nitrogen excretion to the environment. And for herds that have nutrient management plans, that means the manure produced is lower in nitrogen content, and we can spread more tons of manure per acre without exceeding nitrogen application guidelines. And a fourth reason that's evolving right now is concerns about ammonia emissions to the atmosphere. And again, by feeding lower protein rations, the manure that we produce has less volatility to the atmosphere. So as we think about balancing dairy cow diets for protein, and you see protein in quotes, because a cow does not have a protein requirement, they have a requirement for absorbed amino acids in the intestine. Our goal in balancing rations is to meet the rumen degradable protein and rumen undegradable protein requirements for our yields of milk and milk components by feeding a minimum amount of each. The rumen degradable protein, RDP, its purpose is to meet the ammonia and amino acid requirements of the rumen microorganisms so they can maximize carbohydrate digestion and produce microbial protein, which is a source of amino acids for the cow. The rumen undegradable protein, RUP, its purpose is to provide additional amino acids to the cow in the intestine that are not provided by the microbial protein. If we look at this schematic from Dr. Chuck Schwab of dietary protein, when the protein enters the rumen, the non-protein portion of the protein goes NPN and goes directly to ammonia. That ammonia then can go down and be one of the building blocks for microbial protein. The other portion of the dietary protein, the true protein, goes into the rumen, and two things happen to it. A portion of it goes to peptides, amino acids, some to ammonia, and again can be used for microbial protein. And this section is called rumen degradable protein. The other portion of the true protein, the rumen undegradable protein, goes through the rumen basically untouched, goes to the small intestine, and again provides a source of amino acids. So metabolizable protein, absorbed amino acids, is really a combination of rumen undegradable protein, microbial protein, and a small amount of endogenous protein. So what do cows do when we feed crude protein or nitrogen to the cow? They basically do two things. They either they excrete it in the milk, they excrete it in the manure. There's a small portion of the intake nitrogen stored in the body, but that's relatively small. A number of years ago, Mike Van Amberg and our group put together this slide, which is really what happens to nitrogen in the cow. And so he said for animals at about 88 pounds of milk, with a crude protein ranging from 14 to about 18.7, and in this case, he's expressed it as nitrogen intake grams per day, going from about 500 up to almost 750. Let's see what happens to the nitrogen consumed. The blue line is the grams of nitrogen contained in the milk produced by the cow. That's the blue line. You'll note that as we go from across this whole spectrum, that changes very little. So where do we start? Well, we have to separate crude protein from metabolizable protein and amino acids, because cows don't understand crude protein since they don't have a requirement for that. The rumen does have requirements for nitrogen in the rumen, mainly in the form of ammonia and some amino acids and peptides as building blocks for microbial protein. And post-ruminal requirements are for digestible amino acids, which come from either undegraded feed to rumen undegradable protein or microbial protein. In 2001, the Dairy NRC, the National Research Council of Nutrient Requirements of Dairy Cattle publication, suggested that we replace crude protein with metabolizable protein when we evaluate or formulate rations. And they define metabolizable protein as the true protein digested post-ruminally and the component amino acids absorbed in the small intestine. As part of the NRC committee work, they put together a data set of 393 treatment means from 81 studies to look at the relationship between ration protein and milk yield. And you can see the equation they used takes into account dry matter intake and percent protein. So it's really protein intake in grams per day. How does that compare to milk yield? You can see the graph on the left. At any one level of protein, of dietary protein, there's a wide range of milk production. And you can see it's really not a linear function. And when they did the statistics, they found that the crude protein intake per day only accounted for 29% of the variation in milk yield. So 71% of the variation in milk yield in these studies was for something other than the protein intake. So that's why they thought protein was a weak predictor of milk production. Dr. Jim Ferguson, University of Pennsylvania, did a project in the Chesapeake Bay area with about 60 dairy herds, categorized them into ration protein levels, and looked at lactation curves. And you can see that the top two curves are the less than 16% protein rations and the greater than 18% protein rations. And those curves basically are on top of each other, saying there was little difference in these herds, whether they were feeding less than 16 or over 18 in terms of milk production. Alejandro Castillo in California did a survey a number of years ago and looked at 21 California milk herds to look at the relationship of ration crude protein and milk production. And as you can see, there's no relationship. There's a herd at 85 pounds of milk at about 15.5% protein. There's a herd at 85 pounds of milk at about 19.5% protein. So these things indicate to us that crude protein intake is not a good predictor of milk yield. What about metabolizable protein? And this is a chart from a study that was done in Vermont on a dairy sustainability trial a few years ago. And each dot is an individual farm at one visit. in terms of their milk production. The x-axis is the actual milk produced in the herds. The y-axis is the metabolizable predicted milk by the model used to formulate the rations. You can see this is more linear than the crude protein. And in this case, the metabolizable protein predicted milk explained about 72% of the variation in milk production between the herds, much better than using crude protein. As we think about metabolizable protein, there's some considerations. It is not a tabular system, so you just can't go to a book and look up a maintenance requirement, add it to a lactation requirement from a book table. It is calculated based on feed composition, dry matter intake, rate of degradation in the rumen, and rate of passage. A challenge with MP metabolizable protein is feed labs cannot analyze a feed for metabolizable protein. And the metabolizable protein of a specific ration varies depending on level of dry matter intake and rate of passage. So all of these mean that to use the metabolizable protein system, we have to have models that do the calculations to integrate all these factors. So why is crude protein still used? Well, people are very familiar with it and comfortable with the term. If you're in the feed industry in the United States, on the feed tag that goes out with the feed, you have to specify a minimum level of crude protein as part of the regulatory system. Forage laboratories can analyze crude protein, and then analyzed crude protein value then is what we need as inputs on the feeds and forages to our models in the ration programs that then predict the metabolizable protein. So what we see in the United States is most feed companies and consultants are now using programs that do formulate on metabolizable protein, but they also then provide information on the ration crude protein as a piece of information. The formulation is on metabolizable protein. This is information from 5 specific herds where we looked at the crude protein percent in the ration, the grams of metabolizable protein per day in the milk production. If you look at the top line, you can see this ration was 15% crude protein and it predicted milk of 107 pounds. If we go down to the 18.3% ration, you can see it's 107 pounds of milk, but look at the metabolizable protein. They're both the same, 3270, 3269. So again, even though there's a wide range in ration crude protein, there's no difference in metabolizable protein. Have the crude protein levels fed in U.S. dairy herds changed over time? Well, the people at the University of Wisconsin periodically survey high-producing herds in Wisconsin to look at feeding management practices and ration nutrient composition. In 1998, they looked at 6 herds. They were averaging around 31,000 pounds of milk. Their average protein was about 19.5% protein. When they did this in 2010, they looked at 5 herds that were about 34,000 pounds of milk. Their average protein in the ration was about 16.5% protein. So that is the trend we see in the United States. And in the last 20 years, the level of crude protein in the ration is going down while milk production has been going up. There's been a lot of research work done on lactating cows, looking at things like protein level, amino acids, metabolizable protein, milk protein yield. We don't have time to go across all of those in the lecture today. But I thought what we'd do is use a comment from Dr. Alex Christoph at Penn State, who's done a lot of work in this area. And Alex says, based on the long-term trials they've conducted, which looked at all kinds of variabilities in protein levels, amino acids, and so on, they conclude that cows producing up to 88 pounds per day can be fed balanced rations with 16% and even 15% crude protein without impacting milk production or composition. However, Alex also indicated that In some cases, they found depressed dry matter intake in milk when low protein diet, crude protein diets were fed that were deficient in metabolizable protein. So if you're going to feed a low protein diet, you have to make sure that metabolizable protein is adequate and meets the requirements of the animal. A number of years ago, there was a poster at the American Dairy Science Association meetings from Japan, and they had about 7 or 8 diets. Cows milk at about 95 pounds per day, and all the rations were 14 to 15% protein. So that spurred my interest. Well, if they can do that in Japan, what about in the US where we have a different feeding situation? Some early work that was done at Cornell by Dr. Mike Van Amberg on corn silage-based rations, they went down to crude protein levels of 14%, and again had cows at 95 pounds of milk per day. So again, it sort of reinforced what the work from Japan had indicated, that you can make good levels of milk production on relatively low protein rations. So we said, well, what about in real dairy herds? So we went out to Western New York to do a field trial in herds to see what the impact was at lowering the ration crude protein. So we used 2 herds in Western New York, 2 different nutritionists. One was an independent consultant. The other was a representative of a major feed company. Each nutritionist selected a herd they worked with, which they thought had the opportunity to lower ration crude protein levels and be willing to cooperate in the trial. And the rations, we took over the rations for the high group in each herd over an 8-month period of time, did monthly reformulations, and the feed industry people were part of the project because they had to agree that the ration reformulations were reasonable and would work in the herds. In both herds, we lowered ration protein about 1 unit. Metabolizable protein in herd A, we actually decreased that. They were feeding metabolizable protein in excess of energy in the ration. The rations were high starch, high fat, so we couldn't increase ration energy. So we just brought the metabolizable protein down to match the energy predicted milk. In herd B, we increased MP slightly because they were slightly underfeeding metabolizable protein. If you look at the changes in nitrogen intake in grams per cow per day, we decreased at about 56 grams in herd A and about 21 grams in herd B. So in both cases, we were able to lower nitrogen, crude nitrogen intake. When we looked at manure nitrogen excretion, again, we decreased it in both of them. And you'll note that the decreases were very similar to the decreases in nitrogen in the previous slide, which basically said that all the excess nitrogen they were feeding prior to the adjustments was just going into the cow directly to the manure, had no impact on milk production. Milk urea nitrogens decreased about 2 units in each of these herds, which is an index of improved efficiency of nitrogen use. And then when we looked at the feed cost, we looked at the income over total and purchase feed cost. So the red is the initial income over total feed cost. The green is the end of the trial final income over total feed cost. The yellow line is the initial income over purchase feed cost. The blue line is the final income over purchase feed cost. And you can see in both herds, whether we looked at income over total or income over purchase feed cost, we improved it in both herds. Milk production didn't change. Ouch. We then went out to a trial in Delaware County, New York, where we used eight dairy herds in a 3-year trial to look at the potential impact of lowering ration protein. There were 4 feed companies and 1 private consultant involved in the project. And in this project, we had the rations reformulated during the trial by the feed industry professionals working with the farm. We worked with the farms and made monthly farm visits and worked with the dairyman, the feed industry professional, to implement precision feed management plans and to discuss ration formulation strategies, but we let the formulations be done by the feed person. So if we look at the initial and final proteins, you can see in all the herds, we were able to decrease ration crude protein levels. When we look at manure excretion, the change in that, it decreased from a minus 5% less excretion in manure to as much as 20% less excretion in the manure. So basically, it showed what we saw in the trial in Western New York, that when we lower the crude protein in the ration, we also decrease the excretion of nitrogen in the manure back into the environment. When we look at the economics in these herds, we look at the bottom 2 lines. Income over total feed cost change. One herd was 0, all the other herds had a positive. So they all got improvements in income over total feed cost. When you looked at income over purchase feed cost, IOPFC change, all herds are positive. So again, we made progress by lowering the protein and improving the income over purchase feed cost in these herds. If we just look at the summary of the results, milk production changed very little in this trial. And in the trial of Western New York, there was really no change in milk production in those herds across that trial either. We lowered ration crude protein in the Delaware County group about from 17.5 to 15.8. Decreased manure excretion about 60 grams. And the income over feed cost on average over total was about $105 per cow per year. And on the purchase feed cost, an increase of about $140 per cow per year. The final slide in this section is a trial that was done in Dr. Bob Stolfus in Pennsylvania, worked with a herd in Lancaster County that he works with, producing about 85 pounds of milk. And he made adjustments over a 3-year period. And the protein went from about 18.3 to 16.2%. But notice that metabolizable protein changed very little. So even though he had a large change in ration crude protein, there was a very small change in metabolizable protein. So we had 79 rations submitted. I took a subset of 35 rations that were lower than 16.4% protein for this presentation. The average predicted energy corrected milk for these rations was 105 pounds per day. The characteristics of these rations for these 35 herds, we have the average and the range. And I think the average is interesting, the range is more important. For example, forages. On average, 57% of the ration dry matter was forage, but you can see that one herd was up to 66% forage in the ration at this level of 105 pounds of milk. The ration NDFs averaged 30% with about a 10-unit range, sugar 4.4, starch 27.5 with a range of about 10 or 11 units, and fat 5%. When we look at the protein in these herds, the average is 15.7, but note there was a herd at 13.4. And so protein fed as percent of required was 107. So even these herds were feeding metabolizable protein a little bit in excess of requirement. So some of these herds may have an opportunity to even shift protein a little bit lower. The lysine in these herds on average as percent of metabolizable protein was 6.68, methionine 2.37. And again, you can see ranges on the right. Some of these herds were not adequate in either lysine or methionine. When we looked at lysine, 16 herds had lysine levels greater than 6.8% lysine as percent of metabolizable protein. And the 6.8 is sort of the guideline we'd like to see when you use a CNCPS model. In methionine, 19 herds had methionine greater than 2.3. 3 herds had it greater than 2.6. For the CNCPS model, we'd like to see it at least 2.3, but we'd rather have it up close to 2.6. What did they use in terms of rumen-protected amino acid sources? 26 herds fed rumen-protected methionine. That means that 9 herds did not use any protected amino acid product. Lysine was used in 8 herds, and 7 herds used a combination of both added rumen-protected methionine and rumen-protected lysine. What did they use for the rumen undegraded protein sources? The most common was the high bypass soybean meals, heat-treated soybean meals, and or roasted beans, soybeans in 29 herds. 12 herds did use blood meal. 17 herds used an animal protein blend. I realize in some countries you can't use the animal protein blends or blood meal, but as you can see in this study, a lot of the 29 herds were using the high treated vegetable proteins, the soybean meals, for example, as a primary rumen undegradable protein source, and still doing a good job in meeting the lysine and methionine requirements. So opportunities, these herds still have opportunities to potentially feed a little bit less protein in their rations. The key area to increase in these herds would be pay more attention to amino acid balance, because many of these herds, the amino acid balance was not at the recommended levels. And by doing this, we could probably lower the ration protein levels a little bit even more. So let's move over and talk about the fresh cow. This is the cow that really has the opportunity to get a really benefit from the rumen-protected amino acids. The challenge with the fresh cows, there's very little research data on cows in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of lactation. So that's one of the weaknesses that we have to work with. One of the things we do know is that for the first 3 or 4 weeks post-calving, most fresh cows experience a negative protein balance. That means their protein requirement is higher than they're able to consume in the feed. And so many of these cows have to use some body protein reserves during this time to make up for this gap. There was a trial done by Peter Robinson a number of years ago where they fed 2 different diets for the first 42 days of lactation, and they lowered the protein by 1 unit. The difference was the control ration had no added amino acids. The treatment ration had encapsulated lysine and methionine, and also the treatment ration cows received the amino acid product pre-calving. There are no differences in either dry matter intake or milk. So in this study, a slightly lower ration still had the same level of intake in milk, but the metabolizable protein was still adequate to meet the needs. A more interesting study was this study that was done in 1998, where they had a negative control ration. It was deficient in both lysine and methionine, roughly about 90% of what we would like to see in the CNCPS model. Then they had a positive control ration that was a combination of blood, fish, meat, and bone, which had adequate lysine and methionine. A third treatment, they took the negative control and added both lysine and methionine, both pre and post calving, and you can see the grams there. And then they had a fourth treatment where they took the negative control and added higher levels of rumen-protected amino acids. If we look at the results, dry matter intakes were very similar, except for the ration with the higher level of amino acids. The cows did eat consume more feed there. But also note that in terms of milk, the negative control was low in milk compared with all the other treatments. When they added the animal protein as a source of amino acids, they had a significant increase in milk production. And the amino acid added rations, the negative control with amino acids, either the high or low level, again, they were higher in milk production than the control ration, negative control ration. So again, showing a real benefit in the fresh cow of somehow providing additional amino acids and the response in milk, whether it came through the animal protein sources or the rumen protected amino acids. So what are the keys in the fresh cow to getting the high levels of amino acids? Well, the first one is dry matter intake. We have to stimulate these cows to come on feed rapidly and consume lots of feeds. We need digestible forages. We have to keep the rumen bugs happy with a combination of rumen degradable protein, fermentable carbohydrates to make that microbial protein synthesis that we need. We need rumen undegraded protein sources with low variability and high intestinal digestibility. And we probably have to, in many cases, use rumen protected amino acids. So the cows are saying, so what does this mean to me at the farm level? So we then went out to the feed industry and said, research data says that we can feed lower protein rations. Many of you are still feeding higher protein rations. Why don't you want to feed a lower protein ration? What are your problems? And the feed industry came back and said one of the key things that they're concerned about is consistency and quality of daily feed mixing and feeding management. That they didn't feel they were consistent enough that they were comfortable to lower protein levels without risking dropping milk production. They also are concerned about daily variations for each dry matters and quality, which type feeding system, whether it's component versus total mixed ration. Many farms weren't tracking forage dry matters and making adjustments. And some herds, the way the cows were grouped, it was difficult. So these are some of the reasons they were hesitant to improve in lower protein rations, even though they believed that they had potential. These are some of the things that prevented them from implementing them. They also had concerns of many of the forages have high levels of soluble protein. Many of our silages are 60 to 70% soluble protein. Did we get a good forage sample? And was the analysis correct? Were they using milk urea nitrogen as a monitoring tool? And are the ration programs to the point where we can go really, really tight and feel comfortable with the result and implement it on the farm? So these are some of the reasons the feed industry was a little hesitant to really lower protein in a lot of the rations, basically due to on-farm situations. So what are the challenges to lowering ration crude protein in dairy farms? There's always considerations and risks when you alter rations and nutrient management of a dairy farm. And the question is, how large of a safety factor do we need to minimize this risk of dropping milk production when we make these ration changes? Or how much can we lower protein in the ration without affecting milk production? So why the safety factor? Well, we have variability in nutrient contents of forages and dry matter, variability in nutrient content of the non-forage components of the ration, variability in feeding management and daily dry matter intakes, variability in cattle groups and management, variability in digestibility of forages, and variability in digestibility of the non-forage sources. And then sometimes you just don't have the time it takes to put this system together. So what's the value of a safety factor and what does it cost to a herd? And Dr. Mike Van Annenberg put this together for a meeting a couple months ago, Said we have a herd with 500 cows. With the forages available, we can balance a ration of 15% for about 85 pounds of milk. The nutritionist says, well, wait a minute. I don't want to lose milk. Maybe I need a little bit of a safety factor because I don't want to lose milk and don't want to lose a customer. So if we said, well, instead of the 15%, we'll feed 15.5 as our safety factor, that would be about a pound of soybean meal, about 18 cents per cow per day, or about $33,000 per year extra feed costs in this herd to feed that safety factor. Plus there'd be some additional nitrogen excreted in manure. So what are some of the key factors? One of the key factors is mindset. Does the dairy producer and feed professional both feel that lower protein rations can work? And if both people feel they can work, then it's something that we consider on a farm. But if they don't believe it will work, it's not going to work very well at the farm level. Are they willing to accept some risk when you make the change, and how much? And more importantly, how do they monitor the results of the situation? So what are the steps in implementing the rations? We need to do, before we start any adjustments, we have to do in-depth analysis of the current situation in terms of rations, forages, feeding management practices, and we should use metabolizable protein to do this. That'll help us identify if there are some opportunities. And then we have to tie in the goals, objectives, and risk tolerance of the dairy producer as part of our evaluation. We also need to look at feeding management practices to see how consistent we are each day in getting the nutrients delivered to the cow. We could graph milk per cow or intakes. We can look at on-forage dry matter intakes. We can graph daily herd milk urea nitrogens. After doing those first 4 steps, then we have an index whether this herd is a candidate to potentially consider readjusting rations for lower crude protein in the rations. If we decide to move ahead, then we have to follow the following steps. We have to get current forage samples and analyze them for the needed information we need in our computer models that predict metabolizable protein. Then we have to use a model with metabolizable protein to develop potential rations. Then we have to discuss these potential rations with the producer to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and get the producer to buy in or agree to the situation. And then we have to define how we will determine the results. We make the small ration changes, monitor, evaluate, and repeat. If we think we can lower crude protein by a certain amount, maybe we move a half a step the first time, watch the cows, see what the cows say, monitor, evaluate, and then make the second step. We also have to consider where the amino acids fit in this process, and we have to maintain a continuing dialogue with the producer regarding how things are going, how the cows are milking, anything they're seeing that would tell us that we either have gone too far or we have an opportunity to take the next step. So the key points to make this work: number 1, mindset. They have to believe that the system will work. We need low day-to-day variation in feeds and feeding management. Dry matter intake, we have to have good on-farm data so we can monitor whether we're having an impact on intake. We have to optimize rumen fermentation with fermentable carbohydrates and rumen degradable protein to maximize microbial protein production. We need to select rumen undegradable protein sources with low variability. For example, commodity blood meal has a high variability in both in the intestinal availability of the protein, where some of our other products like heat-treated soybean meals and the animal protein blends tend to have less variability. We have to always consider where the amino acids fit into the ration situation, because we need to optimize the amino acids for both milk yield and milk protein production. And then I think monitoring milk urea nitrogen is a good index of nitrogen efficiency and how consistent we are in our daily feeding management practices. So how low can you go? Well, it depends on your metric. If your metric is metabolizable protein, then I think we balance as close to 100% of the requirement as you're comfortable with. And then take a look at crude protein. If metabolizable protein is fine, but crude protein is high, can we slip the protein down a little bit and decrease the nitrogen purchased and nitrogen excreted back to the environment? If the metric is crude protein, most herds should be able to get close to 16%. A lot of herds are 15 to 16, can support 95 plus pounds of milk. And we have herds out here running 14 to 15% that will also work. However, the key thing here is before you make any adjustments in these herds, you still need to evaluate rations with a model that calculates metabolizable protein. And the caveat here is the bottom, very important. Low protein rations only work in herds when metabolizable protein is adequate. If metabolizable protein is inadequate, lower protein rations will lower milk production. So again, metabolizable protein is the base that we start from to make sure that's adequate. And then we see if we have opportunities to adjust the crude protein. So what's next? Well, the 2021 dairy NRC will be coming out in June next year. We don't know at this point what changes they might be making relative to nitrogen and metabolizable protein. In terms of balancing amino acids, there's been a lot of effort on methionine and lysine, but there's some interesting work from both Penn State and Cornell, which says when we have balanced ration, histidine has a potential impact for us. South Dakota has done some good work showing valine has some possibilities. In a recent trial at Cornell, one of our students balanced all the amino acids and again found a nice response. So I think there's a lot more to learn on the amino acid side after we get past methionine and lysine that will get an additional benefit in improvements of efficiency of use in these rations. So to summarize this, both research and commercial herd data indicates we have the opportunity to lower protein in many herds without dropping milk production if metabolizable protein requirements are met. We can probably lower protein a half a unit to a unit in many herds with minimal risk of impacting milk production. This usually improves our profitability, lowers excretion to the environment, and is going to minimize the risk of ammonia emissions to the environment. And the key to the whole system is consistent management with low variability in the feeds and feeding management system is the key to making this approach work. Without consistent management and low variability, it's difficult to make the lower protein rations effectively work without the risk of lowering milk production. So we thank you for your attention. Hopefully you've gained a few ideas. And I guess at this point, we'll be ready to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Chase. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendees control panel. Dr. Chase, our first question is, when making reference to MP and amino acids as percent of MP in your presentation, are those numbers from CNCPS biology or 2001 dairy NRC?
These are from the CNCPS biology.
All right, very well, thank you. Where are you comfortable balancing MP as a percent of requirement once cows hit peak production? Are you comfortable dropping below 100% of NP requirements in CNCPS? I
would rarely go less than 100%. There may be a specific herd that you might try it in, but I think in general, I'd be a little uncomfortable going below 100% in many of the herds we work with, yes.
Okay, thank you. Next question, is milk urea content a reliable indicator of the optimal level of metabolizable protein in the diet? If so, what would be your recommended level?
Well, milk urea nitrogen is an index of the nitrogen efficiency of the cow, not specifically the quantity of MP. It's a good index of efficiency. So the more efficient cows have lower milk urea nitrogen. The range that we tend to use in the US is we tend to like to see milk urea nitrogen between 8 and 12 milligrams per deciliter. A few herds will run a little bit lower than that. Once we get down to 5 or 6, we probably are too low, and we may be impacting the rumen environment and the efficiency. So our range is about 8 to 12.
All right, very well, thank you. Were bypass amino acids implemented in the Delaware County field trials?
Some herds, yes, some herds, no.
All right. And next, how often do you recommend forage analysis to be able to get a good grasp on composition variations so to decide if a risk factor is necessary?
A part of that, I think, comes back, Scott, to how variable do you think that particular storage facility is? For example, if we have a bunker silo, we fill it in a day or two, there's going to be less variability in that bunker than if it takes us 5 or 6 days. Traditionally, many of our feed people, when they visit the farms, probably maybe twice a month, will probably take a sample twice a month and just double check whether it's still the same or whether it's changed. So the frequency will vary a little bit on the variability in the structure, but a lot of times if we take a sample a couple times a month, it'll give us a monitor whether we do or don't need to make a change in our rations.
All right, very well. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions here. Do you think that lysine-methionine ratio is a good parameter to assess the effectiveness of MP, or should we be satisfied with the intake in grams?
I think the grams are the better idea. And actually the new concept is we look at the grams, I think is the way to go, because cows need grams, not percents. So I think it's simpler to calculate the grams.
All right. And then our last question here. Whenever we reduce dietary crude protein lower than 16.5% crude protein, must we balance for lysine and methionine?
You're going to need to balance for the amino acids. And again, that's where the mix comes in of what type of rumen undegradable source are you using, how much microbial protein are you providing, and how much additional amino acids do you need. So I think when we start going low on these higher producing cows, we always have to look at the amino acids as a part of the puzzle.
All right, very well. And I said one last question, but I am going to do another one here real quick. We have a fan here, Dr. Chase. The gentleman says, hello, awesome presentation, Dr. Chase. What are the negative consequences in animal metabolism when we overfeed with metabolizable protein?
Well, when you overfeed, then the excess ammonia has to go to the liver, be converted to urea nitrogen, and excreted, and that costs energy. And if that happens continuously over a long period of time at high levels, there can be some tissue damage and liver problems and so on.
Very well. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Chase. And I want to thank everybody for sticking with us today during our technical difficulties. You guys hung in there, and we really appreciate that. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll forward them to you along with the unanswered questions from today's session. Remember, you can receive 1 ARPAS credit for today's webinar. A certificate of participation is available to download in the Handouts tab on your control panel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link of a recording to today's webinar that you can share with others in your organization. Links to past webinars are also available at balchemanh.com/realscience. Balchem is hosting a webinar every Tuesday through the end of June. Our next webinar will feature Dr. John Lucy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who will share insights about the future of milk protein as a functional food. Go to www.balchemanh.com/realscience and click on the Register Now button to get signed up. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Chase, thank you for joining us.
With today's low milk prices and rising feed protein costs, now is the time to turn up the dial on rumen efficiency. NitroSure precision-release nitrogen is designed to help stabilize rumen ammonia pools by synchronizing carbohydrate and nitrogen availability to the microflora. Providing a consistent supply of ammonia is proven to increase rumen microbial populations, improve fiber and dry matter digestibility, and stimulate microbial protein yield, all leading to greater efficiencies in forage utilization and higher milk and milk component production. Maximize rumen microflora with NitroSure to turn up rumen efficiency and productivity.